I might not sound like it, but I was born and grew up on Long Island in New York State. In November of 2002, while I was in college, the big news back home that month was that several mobsters, members of the Lucchese family, were arrested and they were living in plain sight as our neighbors in western Suffolk County. The highest ranking member, Joseph Caridi, recognized as the then consligiere, was called a Tony Soprano of Long Island because he based his activities in an adult entertainment center with a strip club on the border of the towns of Comac and Brentwood called Cinderella's, a pun where the first three letters are SIN instead of CIN. As far as seedy strip clubs go, Cinderella's is there with the seediest. They served alcohol and would only ID patrons if they wanted to buy a watered-down drink, which made under 18 high school students part of their customer base. That makes sense in retrospect, because if it was mafia-controlled, then they had to have had local cops on their payroll. It doesn't seem like Caridi had any real ownership in the place, at least on paper. Instead, he and his crew, experts at intimidating and shaking down small businesses, paid the owner a visit one day in February of 2002, put a gun to his head, and informed him that they were now taking the place over. Once the mobsters took over the place, they began to skim about $5,000 a week, while also making it the headquarters for their illegal bookmaking and gambling operations. All in all, the Luccheses are estimated to have brought in about $2 million during the 9 months that they had set up shop. But their hostile takeover was also the beginning of their end, because the seedy strip club owner they chased away went to his local law enforcement contacts to retaliate. What happened next was a massive investigation by Suffolk County Police and the FBI that brought down Caridi and 14 other associates in a tale in a case that illustrates the slow decay of Cosa Nostra. Born on November 28, 1949, in Queens, not much is known about Caridi's earliest days. It's believed that his mafia career began as an associate for the Bonanno family in the early 1980s, and he was later traded to the Luccheses to help resolve a dispute between the two families during a sit-down in 1994, which puts him in his 40s at this point. In 1995, it is believed that he became a made man and was inducted into the family. The family's previous bosses had traditionally enjoyed long and stable reigns following the end of the Castello-Marise War. Tommy Gagliano ruled from the shadows and died in the early 1950s, with his longtime underboss, Tommy Lucchese, succeeding him. He passed away in 1967 from brain cancer and named Capo Regime Tony Ducks Corallo to be his successor. Tony Duck's reign was cut short in 1985 when he and the leadership of the other families, minus the Bonannos, were indicted in what would be known as the Mafia Commission trial. In November of 1986, knowing that he was going to be found guilty along with his top leadership, Corallo wanted to preserve his family's tradition of peaceful transfers of power. So he summoned Capos Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso to his home. Casso was offered the position of boss, but he turned it down and suggested it be Amuso instead. From that point forward, the family had a new boss, and Casso became the underboss. Amuso and Casso were hastily chosen for their roles. Within a few years, Casso would become a government witness after being demoted by Amuso, and in 1993, Vic Amuso was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison for multiple crimes that included more than a few murders. But unlike Tony Ducks, Amuso clung to power and ruled through acting bosses. Born in 1934, he is now older than President Joe Biden, and he still retains the top position in his family, though it's unclear how much actual power he still wields today. If the 1995 date for his induction is accurate, then Joseph Caridi, nicknamed Joe C., had already been part of the Long Island crew and must have been particularly close with the capo, Louis Dedone, better known as Louis Bagels. In the years between Amuso's conviction in 1995, Several family members from Brooklyn that were rivals of Amuso were sent to prison. In order to stabilize the organization, it was reorganized, with Capo Joe DeFede becoming acting boss, Stephen Wonderboy Crea remaining underboss, and Louis Bagels becoming the new consigliere. Newly minted soldier Joe C. was later bumped up to the capo position of the Long Island crew to replace his old boss. Vic Amuso employed an unpredictable management style that routinely used violence as an enforcement mechanism. In 1998, Joe DeFede was indicted on 9 counts of racketeering and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While he avoided a lengthy sentence, Amuso was not happy with his plea, as an admission of guilt to those charges was believed to be the equivalent of admitting that Cosa Nostra exists. He was still part of the organization, but his future was uncertain. Stephen Crea was promoted to acting boss, and he began to kick up profits to Amuso, which were much more than what DeFede had been sending. In 1999, believing that DeFede had been stealing money, Amuso put a contract out on him. But DeFede found out and became a government informant. In 2000, Crea and several other members were arrested and put in prison. That year, Louis Bagels was named the next acting boss, and he promoted his friend, Joe C., to be his consigliere. But their time at the top would last less than 2 years. In 2001, according to testimony from Caridi's trial, the newly promoted mobster began to shake down a popular Long Island restaurant called Hudson and McCoy's in a situation that resembled a scene from the movie Goodfellas. At the time, owners Frank and Roger Basile had an unwanted business partner named Louis Kassman. Kassman was well connected to the Gambino family and was often called John Gotti's adopted son because of his close relationship with Junior. He was pillaging the place to the point of bankruptcy, so the owners went to their own mafia contacts to see if Kassman could be forced out. Instead, they replaced a mafia-connected partner with 2 full-fledged mobsters, Joe Caridi and acting Lucchese capo regime John Sorella. In the summer of 2001, they were taking half of the restaurant's profits, which amounted to $10,000 on some nights. But they also delivered on their promise to kick Kassman out. In addition to sucking money from the business, they also forced the brothers to change some of their suppliers to companies connected to Caridi. We don't know the exact financial numbers of the business, but it seems safe to say that their new partners were costing them more than the old one. Law enforcement became aware of their involvement with the restaurant when they began to monitor phone calls between the mobsters. In one call, Sorella is recorded telling an underling he installed to manage the place, "If Kassman shows up, you treat him like the enemy." Caridi came under investigation in February 2002 when he took over Cinderella's. During that time, law enforcement became aware of a cell phone shop that was providing the mobsters with phones under other people's names. Thinking that these phones were laundered and impossible for law enforcement to trace, they spoke freely on them. But that was a false sense of security, and this information provided the state with overwhelming evidence to perform mass arrests. Caridi and 14 others were arrested in a massive bust, with 75 investigators raiding 14 homes and businesses across Suffolk County, Nassau County, Queens, and Brooklyn. All were men between the ages of 39 and 77, which should give you an indication that 25 years ago, the mafia was already having trouble attracting younger potential members. At the same time, Joe DeFede and former Lucchese acting boss Al DeArco were also cooperating with the feds, and their testimony would get acting boss Louis Bagels sentenced to prison for life. Caridi would fare better in the short term. He pleaded guilty to extortion, but refused to admit that he was part of the Lucchese family. Instead, he told the judge that he did it for the Caridi enterprises. No one believed that, but it was enough to appease family boss Vic Amuso that he was not a rat. In 2003, Joe C. was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Caridi's arrest in 2002 occurred when The Sopranos was one of TV's most popular shows, with its 4th season then on the air. So the public, with a renewed fascination about the Mafia, became excited about the parallels between the show and real life. The strip club base of operations was just one aspect. Caridi was also said to hold informal meetings with fellow mobsters at his children's sports games, similar to Tony Soprano. In 2009, Joe C. was released from prison after serving 6 years. He is said to have gone into semi-retirement following his release. However, the family seems to have a rotating cast of members acting as rulers for Musso. And Caridi is believed to have attended meetings among the upper management. He would also be about 60 years old in 2009, which makes him a little too young then to retire from a life that doesn't permit it. In 2024, at the age of 75, he passed away from natural causes. Because of relentless pressure from law enforcement, combined with the Musso's extremely violent style of management, the number of official members from the Lucchese family out on the streets is estimated to be half of what it was in the year 2000. While it's still a powerful force in the world of organized crime, many believe it to be past its peak. The owner of Cinderella's, who went to the police following Joe C.'s takeover, has never been publicly named, so we don't know if the mob had ever retaliated against him. But almost 25 years later, the business still exists, and it appears to have never been updated over the decades, leaving it as a time capsule to a period that has long passed.